January 17, 1942. Pearl Harbor, Territory of Hawaii, ****. The water is black and thick with oil. It clings to everything, the pilings of the docks, the hulls of rescue boats, the hands of the salvage crews who wade through it like mourners through a graveyard. Beneath the surface, in the suffocating darkness 40 feet down, something enormous rests on the harbor floor. The USS West Virginia. Once a symbol of American naval might, now a tomb. 406 men are still inside her steel belly, sealed in compartments that became coffins the moment Japanese torpedoes tore through her port side on that Sunday morning 6 weeks ago. The divers can hear things down there, the groan of buckling metal, the whisper of trapped air escaping through cracks, the silence that speaks louder than any explosion. Above, on the oil-slicked surface, Salvage Master Captain Homer Wallen stares at the wreckage and thinks about what the enemy believes. He thinks about what is impossible. He thinks about what must be done anyway. In Tokyo, in the marble halls where Japan's naval strategists convene beneath portraits of emperors and maps of conquered territories, there is certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from engineering prowess, from mathematical calculation, from the cold logic of physics and tonnage. A battleship that has capsized and settled into harbor mud cannot be raised. The numbers do not lie. The USS West Virginia displaced 32,600 tons fully loaded. She took 9 torpedoes and 2 bomb hits. She rolled to port, flooded through massive ruptures in her hull, then settled on an uneven bottom with her superstructure half submerged and her main deck awash. To raise such a vessel would require clearing thousands of tons of water from flooded compartments, sealing ruptures 20 feet wide, then somehow generating enough buoyancy to lift dead weight equivalent to a 15-story building from soft mud that had become her grave. It is not pessimism that makes Japanese naval engineers dismiss the possibility, it is mathematics. It is the same mathematics that built their own battleships, that calculated firing solutions for the Yamato's 18-inch guns, that measured the tensile strength of steel and the load-bearing capacity of salvage equipment. By every rational measure, the West Virginia will remain where she lies until she is cut apart for scrap or left to rust into the seabed. The Americans, the strategists believe, will mourn their losses and build new ships. They will not, cannot, undo what has been done. But the Japanese strategists, for all their brilliance, all their meticulous planning that brought 6 aircraft carriers across the Pacific undetected, for all their understanding of engineering and tactics and the brutal efficiency of surprise, do not understand something fundamental about the nation they have awakened. They do not understand that America does not accept the mathematics of impossibility. They do not understand that the country built by men who cross an ocean in wooden ships, who laid railroad tracks across deserts and mountains, who turned swamps into cities and prairies into bread baskets, does not recognize the word cannot. They do not understand that the divers now suiting up on the docks of Pearl Harbor, strapping lead weights to their belts and checking the seals on their brass helmets, are not merely salvage workers. They are descendants of a nation that believes problems exist to be solved, that obstacles exist to be overcome, that the impossible is simply the difficult that takes a little longer. The attack came at 7:55 a.m. on December 7, 1941. The West Virginia was moored at Battleship Row, inboard of the USS Tennessee, which meant she absorbed impacts meant for both vessels. Lieutenant Commander J.S. Harper was officer of the deck when the first torpedo struck. He would later describe the sound, not an explosion exactly, but a deep, shuddering boom that seemed to come from the ship's bones, followed by the shriek of tearing steel. The West Virginia took 7 torpedoes in rapid succession along her port side, each one punching through the anti-torpedo blister system that was supposed to protect her. Water flooded into the engineering spaces, the crew compartments, the magazines. She began to lease heavily to port, heeling over toward a capsize that would have trapped everyone still alive inside her. But counterflooding saved her. Officers and crew, acting on training and instinct even as explosions shook the decks beneath their feet, opened the starboard side ballast tanks and let seawater pour in. The deliberate flooding leveled the ship, preventing a complete rollover, but it also doomed her. With water rushing in from both sides, the West Virginia settled slowly, almost gently, until her keel touched bottom and her main deck sank below the waterline. Men escaped through hatches and portholes, swimming through burning oil. Others never made it out. For 3 weeks after the attack, salvage crews could hear tapping from inside. Morse code, desperate and methodical. Men were alive in sealed compartments, breathing whatever air remained, drinking whatever condensation they could collect, waiting in absolute darkness for rescue that could not reach them quickly enough. The tapping stopped on December 24th, Christmas Eve. When the divers finally cut through the hull months later, they found evidence of survival that would haunt them: scratch marks on the steel walls, calendars scratched into paint showing the men had lived 16 days past the attack, empty ration tins, and silence. The kind of silence that makes men question what they are capable of doing next. What happened next would require more than courage. It would require industrial genius on a scale that contradicted every assumption about what was salvageable and what was lost. Captain Wallen, appointed salvage officer for the Pacific Fleet just days after the attack, surveyed the wreckage at Pearl Harbor with the eyes of an engineer and the heart of a man who refused to let steel coffins become monuments to defeat. 7 battleships had been struck. The Arizona was a shattered ruin, her magazine explosion having killed 1,177 men in an instant. She would become a memorial. The Oklahoma had capsized completely, her hull inverted and exposed like a beached whale. The California had settled on the bottom, flooded and listing. The Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, had been deliberately beached to prevent her from sinking in the channel. The West Virginia, the Maryland, and the Tennessee, all damaged, all considered total constructive losses by traditional salvage standards. The Japanese planners had studied these ships, knew their capabilities, understood their vulnerabilities. They had struck to cripple America's Pacific battleship fleet so thoroughly that the United States would be forced to sue for peace, or at the very least, would be unable to challenge Japanese expansion for years. The mathematics supported this conclusion. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed. More than 2,400 Americans dead. It would take years to build replacements. By then, Japan's perimeter would be impregnable. But the mathematics did not account for the men who now descended into the darkness. Navy divers, most of them young, many of them from places where diving meant lakes and rivers, not harbors choked with corpses and fuel oil. They wore heavy canvas suits with brass helmets, air pumped down through rubber hoses from surface compressors. Visibility underwater was measured in inches. The oil that covered everything created a suffocating blackness. Divers had to work by touch, their gloved hands groping along twisted steel, finding ruptures, feeling for structural damage, mapping by memory and instinct what they could not see. They carried patching materials down with them, wooden boards wrapped in canvas and coated with tar, steel plates, hydraulic jacks, welding equipment that somehow had to function underwater. They worked in shifts, 15 minutes down, then decompression, then down again. The psychological toll was immense. Every dark compartment might contain bodies. Every hatch they opened might release a pocket of trapped air that carried with it the smell of death. And yet they descended, again and again, because the alternative was leaving those ships where they lay. The plan to raise the West Virginia seemed mad even to those who would execute it. First, divers had to seal the torpedo holes, gaps large enough to drive a truck through, edges curled and jagged from the force of underwater explosions. They built wooden patches called cofferdams, essentially watertight boxes constructed around the holes from the outside of the hull. Each patch had to be precisely fitted, sealed with gaskets, then bolted in place while divers worked in zero visibility and constant danger of shifting wreckage. One patch might take days to install. The West Virginia required dozens. Simultaneously, crews had to clear the interior of debris, shattered equipment, collapsed bulkheads, personal effects, bodies. The pumps had to be positioned, massive industrial pumps capable of moving thousands of gallons per minute, because once the patching was complete, the entire ship would need to be dewatered. Every flooded compartment would need to be emptied, the water replaced with air, until the ship generated enough buoyancy to lift herself from the mud. The Japanese engineers who dismissed this possibility based their assumptions on conventional salvage techniques. They understood lifting vessels in dry docks, where control conditions and heavy equipment made such operations feasible. But to essentially rebuild a ship underwater, to seal and pump out a vessel that had been shattered by torpedoes, that had been flooded and settled and corroded by seawater for months, this exceeded the parameters of any salvage operation in naval history. The equipment required did not exist in sufficient quantity. The techniques had never been attempted on this scale. The workforce would need to labor in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. And all of it would have to be done while the war raged across the Pacific, while resources were desperately needed elsewhere, while every ton of steel and every skilled worker was precious. By rational calculation, it made more sense to write off the West Virginia and focus on building new vessels. But that would mean accepting the enemy's victory. That would mean leaving those 406 men entombed forever in steel that flew the American flag. That would mean admitting that some things, once broken, cannot be fixed. Spring 1942. The work continues in the relentless tropical heat. Divers descend into the West Virginia's flooded compartments, their air hoses trailing behind them like umbilical cords connecting them to the world of light and oxygen. Inside the ship, it is a maze of flooded passageways and collapsed decks. They work by feel, their fingers tracing conduits and pipes, finding valves that need to be closed, ruptures that need to be mapped. They surface with reports that seem impossible. The damage is worse than the initial surveys indicated. There are secondary structural failures. Bulkheads that looked intact from the outside have collapsed internally. And yet, somehow, the patches are installed. One by one, the great ruptures in the West Virginia's hull are sealed. Not permanently, not perfectly, but well enough. Well enough to contain the water once the pumping begins. Well enough to give the ship a chance. The pumps start in late spring. Diesel-powered monsters that roar day and night, their exhausts belching black smoke, their intake hoses snaking down into the flooded compartments. At first, nothing seems to happen. The water level drops by inches, then feet, but the ship remains stubbornly settled in the mud. The pumps labor against leaks, against seepage through imperfect seals, against the sheer volume of water that has to be displaced. Engineers calculate, recalculate, adjust. More pumps are brought in. Crews work around the clock. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the West Virginia begins to rise. The main deck breaks the surface. Then the forward superstructure. Then more of the hull emerges, streaming water and oil, revealing the full extent of the damage, the gaping wounds now patched with makeshift wood and steel, the twisted railings and collapsed structures. But she rises. Inch by inch, foot by foot, ton by impossible ton, the dead battleship lifts herself from the harbor floor. When news reaches Tokyo, there is disbelief. Intelligence reports are checked and rechecked. The vessel that appeared in reconnaissance photographs, floating at Pearl Harbor just 6 months after being declared a total loss, could not be the West Virginia. It must be another ship. But it is confirmed, the Americans have done the impossible. They have raised a battleship that every calculation said should remain on the bottom. And if they raise one, they will raise others. The strategic implications ripple through Japanese naval planning. The losses inflicted at Pearl Harbor are not permanent. The fleet that was crippled is being resurrected. The months that Japan needed to fortify their positions, the breeding room they thought they had purchased with surprise and violence, are evaporating. The Americans are not behaving rationally. They are not accepting their losses and moving forward. They are undoing the past. They are salvaging not just ships, but the very possibility of victory. What the strategists in Tokyo could not see from their maps and reports was what the divers saw every day when they descended into the darkness. They saw American abundance not in the ships that floated, but in the relentless commitment to save what had been lost. They saw it in the mountains of equipment that appeared whenever it was needed: more pumps, more patches, more diving gear, more steel, more workers. In any other navy, the salvage of the West Virginia would have been limited by resources, by the availability of specialists, by competing priorities. But at Pearl Harbor, the resources simply appeared. Pumps were diverted from construction projects across the Pacific. Steel was fabricated in mainland factories and shipped across thousands of miles of ocean. Divers were trained in accelerated programs and sent to Hawaii by the hundreds. The entire industrial might of a continental nation was bent toward the task of lifting broken ships from the harbor floor. This was the abundance that the Japanese strategists had not calculated, not the abundance of what America possessed at the moment of attack, but the abundance of what America could generate when challenged. By June 1942, the West Virginia was afloat, though barely seaworthy. Her main deck was clear, her superstructure exposed, her list corrected. But she was a hollow shell, her interior a devastated landscape of collapsed steel and corroded equipment. The pumps had lifted her, but she would need years of repair before she could fight again. She was towed to dry dock, where workers began the painstaking process of rebuilding her internal systems, her engines, her armament. The men who had died inside her were finally recovered, given proper burials, their sacrifice honored. And the divers who had descended into the darkness, who had worked in conditions that nightmares are made of, who had patched impossible holes and pumped away uncountable gallons of seawater, moved on to the next wreck. Because there were others. The California would be raised. The Nevada would be refloated and repaired. Even the capsized Oklahoma, which required a more dramatic solution, cables attached to land-based winches, slowly rolling the entire inverted hull upright, would eventually break the surface. The harbor that the Japanese had turned into a graveyard was becoming a resurrection ground. The West Virginia would not return to service quickly. While the divers moved on to other salvage operations, shipyard workers spent months gutting her interior, removing everything damaged beyond repair, then slowly rebuilding. New engines were installed. Her fire control systems were modernized. Her anti-aircraft armament was dramatically increased. Where she once carried only a handful of AA guns, she would return to service bristling with quad 40mm mounts and 20mm cannons. The battleship that had been sunk in 1941 would be reborn as a more capable vessel, her painful reconstruction forcing innovations in damage control and survivability that would inform every American warship built afterward. But more than that, she would return as proof of something intangible, something that could not be measured in tons or calculated in equations. She would return as evidence that American power was not merely what existed at any given moment, but what could be created, salvaged, rebuilt, and resurrected through sheer determination and industrial capacity. September 1943. 21 months after rising from the harbor floor, the USS West Virginia departed Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, fully repaired, fully manned, and fully capable. She would go on to serve in nearly every major Pacific campaign, bombarding Japanese positions at Leyte Gulf, where her 16-inch guns pounded enemy fortifications, fighting in the Surigao Strait, where she engaged Japanese battleships in the last battleship versus battleship action in history, supporting landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The ship that was supposed to remain on the bottom of Pearl Harbor would fire tens of thousands of shells at enemy targets, would survive kamikaze attacks, would earn 5 battle stars. Her crew, many of them assigned after the salvage operation, served aboard a vessel they knew had been dead and was now alive. A ship that carried with it the ghosts of December 7 and the defiance of those who refused to let that day be the end of the story. The divers who made it possible, men whose names rarely appeared in the histories, whose work was done in darkness and silence and danger, understood something profound about the nation they served. They understood that American strength was not in the invincibility of its weapons or the perfection of its strategies. It was in the stubborn, irrational refusal to accept defeat. It was in the conviction that problems, no matter how complex, could be solved if you broke them into smaller problems and worked through them one at a time. It was in the industrial abundance that could turn the impossible into the merely difficult, that could mobilize resources on a scale that made miracles routine. When they descended into the flooded compartments of the West Virginia, carrying their patches and pumps and tools, they were not thinking about grand strategy or symbolic victories. They were thinking about the next seal to install, the next hatch to open, the next section to pump out. But collectively, their work added up to something greater, a demonstration that the attack on Pearl Harbor, devastating as it was, had not achieved its strategic objective. America would not accept the mathematics of loss. America would salvage, repair, rebuild, and return. And in doing so, would reveal to the enemy that they had not crippled the Pacific Fleet. They had merely given it reason to rise again. There is a symbolic weight to the salvage operations at Pearl Harbor that extends beyond the tactical value of the ships themselves. By the time the West Virginia returned to service, the American fleet had already shifted its focus to aircraft carriers. The battleship, long the symbol of naval dominance, was being superseded by carrier task forces and aviation-based warfare. The West Virginia and her sisters, for all their restored firepower, would serve primarily in shore bombardment roles, supporting amphibious landings rather than engaging enemy battle lines. In purely practical terms, the resources invested in raising and repairing the Pearl Harbor battleships might have been better allocated to building new carriers or submarines. But practicality was not the point. The salvage operations were a declaration that America would not abandon its own, that losses would not be accepted passively, that the enemy's calculations about what was possible were wrong. Every shade lifted from the harbor floor was a refutation of Japanese assumptions about American resolve. Every patched hull that floated again was evidence that the nation possessed not just material abundance, but an abundance of will. The Japanese strategists, studying reconnaissance photos and intelligence reports from Pearl Harbor throughout 1942 and 1943, began to understand the nature of their miscalculation. The attack had been executed flawlessly, surprise achieved, targets struck, damage inflicted. By every immediate measure, it was a tactical success. But strategically, it had failed to account for the one variable that could not be quantified in pre-war planning, the American response to challenge. The strategists had assumed rationality, that a nation confronted with devastating losses would calculate the cost of continued war and seek accommodation. They had not anticipated that America would respond to devastation by increasing production tenfold, by training millions of soldiers and sailors, by turning the entire economy into a war machine that could replace every loss and generate surplus. They had not anticipated that the ships sunk at Pearl Harbor would be raised, repaired, and returned to fight. They had planned for an America that would count the cost. They encountered an America that refused to calculate surrender. The divers, for their part, carried no grand ideology into the depths. They carried lead weights and air hoses and tools. They thought about decompression schedules and patching techniques and the layout of flooded compartments. But in their labor, unintentional and unself-conscious, they embodied the essential character of the nation they served. They demonstrated that American power was not in perfection but in perseverance, not in avoiding damage but in recovering from it, not in winning every battle but in refusing to stay down after being knocked down. The brass helmets they wore, the heavy canvas suits, the lead-weighted boots that let them walk along the harbor floor, these became the tools of resurrection. And when they surfaced, when they reported that another patch was sealed or another compartment pumped clear, they were adding tons of buoyancy not just to the West Virginia, but to the entire war effort. They were proving that what the enemy believed to be impossible was, in fact, merely very difficult. And difficult was something America knew how to do. By war's end, the salvage operations at Pearl Harbor had recovered or repaired 6 of the 8 battleships struck on December 7. The Arizona and Oklahoma remained beyond salvation, the Arizona because her destruction was too complete, the Oklahoma because even after being righted and raised, her internal damage was determined to be beyond economical repair and she was eventually sold for scrap. But the others, West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, Nevada, Pennsylvania, all returned to service. Collectively, they fired thousands of tons of shells at Japanese positions across the Pacific. They supported landings that rolled back enemy conquests island by island. They participated in battles that closed the naval news around the Japanese home islands. And they served as floating proof that the attack which was meant to cripple American naval power had instead galvanized it. The ships that rose from Pearl Harbor carried with them a message more powerful than their guns: we are still here. You cannot sink us permanently. We will return. In the quiet moments between operations, when the divers sat on the docks and cleaned their equipment, they sometimes talked about what they had seen below. They described the darkness, the oil, the bodies, the eerie beauty of sunlight filtering through clear patches of water and illuminating the skeletal remains of superstructures. They talked about the claustrophobia, the constant awareness that their air came from a compressor on the surface through a rubber hose that could tangle or sever, the discipline required to remain calm when every instinct screamed to surface immediately. And they talked about the satisfaction, deep and wordless, of seeing a ship rise. Of knowing that their work, invisible and dangerous and unglamorous, had changed an outcome that the enemy considered fixed. They had lifted battleships. Not with cranes and dry docks, though those came later. They had lifted battleships with patches and pumps and stubborn refusal to accept the verdict of physics and circumstance. They had lifted battleships with the same American abundance that produced tanks and planes and ships in quantities that astonished allies and terrified enemies. But more than material abundance, they had demonstrated an abundance of spirit, the belief that effort matters, that persistence pays off, that impossible is just another word for work that hasn't been finished yet. December 1944. 3 years after the attack. The West Virginia steams through the Surigao Strait in the Philippine Islands, part of Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battle line. Japanese battleships approach in darkness, the last gasps of a dying naval power attempting to disrupt American landings at LiftA. The West Virginia's fire control radar, technology that didn't exist on her in 1941, locks onto enemy vessels at a range where visual targeting would be impossible. Her 16-inch guns, restored and modernized, open fire. The shells arc through the tropical night, each one weighing more than a ton, traveling at supersonic speed. They strike Japanese battleships that themselves were once considered unsinkable, and they strike with accuracy that radar fire control makes possible. The Battle of Surigao Strait lasts hours. When dawn comes, the Japanese southern force has been annihilated. Among the victors, steaming in formation, her battle ensign flying above decks that 3 years earlier were submerged in Pearl Harbor mud, is the USS West Virginia. The battleship that could not be raised. The ship that Japanese strategists had written off as a permanent loss. She has returned, and she has fought, and she has won. There is poetry in this, not the artificial poetry of propaganda, but the genuine poetry of historical reversal. The weapon that was destroyed has become the destroyer. The victim has become the victor. And the assumptions that guided Japanese planning, that America was soft, that it would count the cost and withdraw, that its material advantages were meaningless against spiritual resolve and tactical surprise, have been revealed as catastrophic miscalculations. Because the divers who descended into darkness did not calculate odds. They did not weigh costs against benefits. They simply did the work, day after day, patch after patch, until the impossible became the accomplished. And in doing so, they revealed that American abundance was not merely economic but philosophical. It was the abundance of belief that challenges exist to be met, that failures exist to be overcome, that the verdict of circumstance is always subject to appeal through effort and ingenuity and sheer bloody-minded determination. The war would end 9 months later with Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Among the assembled vessels of the victorious Pacific Fleet were battleships that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor. They were there not as museum pieces or symbolic relics but as functioning warships, recently engaged in combat, their crews standing at attention in dress uniforms on decks that had once been underwater. The Japanese delegation, coming aboard to sign the instruments of surrender, could see across the water the evidence of their failed strategy. The ships they had struck were afloat. The fleet they had crippled was ascendant. The nation they had hoped to intimidate had instead been awakened, and its response had been to mobilize resources on a scale that made the very concept of permanent loss obsolete. The surrender was signed not just because of atomic weapons or Soviet declaration of war or the cumulative weight of battlefield defeats. It was signed because Japan finally understood what the divers at Pearl Harbor had demonstrated 3 years earlier: America does not quit. It salvages. It repairs. It returns. And it remembers. In the decades after the war, the story of the Pearl Harbor salvage operations faded somewhat from public consciousness, overshadowed by more dramatic narratives of combat and heroism. The divers who did the work went home, took off their helmets, and resumed civilian lives. Most of them never talked much about what they had done. When pressed, they would describe technical details, the patches, the pumps, the challenges of underwater welding. They rarely spoke about the psychological weight, the nightmares, the faces of the men they recovered from sealed compartments. They didn't need to. Their work spoke for itself. The ships floated. That was enough. But for those who study the war, who try to understand not just the battles but the industrial and psychological conflicts beneath them, the salvage of the Pearl Harbor battleships represents something essential about American power in the 20th century. It was not that America was invincible; Pearl Harbor proved it was not. It was not that American equipment was superior; early in the war, Japanese aircraft and torpedoes often outperformed their American counterparts. It was that America possessed the capacity to absorb catastrophic damage and recover, to learn from failure, to mobilize resources in quantities that turned strategic calculations upside down. The Japanese strategists who believed no one could lift a battleship were correct, in a sense. No one could. Not by traditional means, not by conventional salvage techniques, not by any method that existed in the standard engineering playbooks. But the Americans did not attempt to lift the battleships by traditional means. They invented new techniques. They improvised solutions. They brute-forced the problem with labor and equipment and persistence until the impossible became merely the difficult, and the difficult became the done. The USS West Virginia served until 1947, when she was decommissioned and eventually sold for scrap. In her final years, she carried battle scars from Pearl Harbor and from every engagement afterward, patched steel that bore witness to resurrection and revenge. When she was cut apart in the scrap yards, her steel was recycled, melted down, reformed into new products. In a sense, she was salvaged one final time, her material abundance contributing to the post-war economy that would rebuild not just America but the world. The men who had served aboard her, who had fought aboard a vessel they knew had been dead and was now alive, carried with them the knowledge that they had been part of something larger than a ship. They had been part of a story about national character, about the will to overcome, about the stubborn refusal to let the enemy's first punch be the final word. There is a lesson in the harbor at Pearl Harbor, in the oil-slick waters where divers once descended into darkness. It is not a lesson about invincibility or supremacy. It is a lesson about resilience. About the difference between being knocked down and staying down. About the abundance that comes not from having everything you need at the moment of crisis, but from having the systems and the spirit to generate what you need in response to crisis. The Japanese strategists calculated tonnage and displacement, armor thickness, and torpedo explosive force. They did not calculate for the divers who would work in darkness, or the engineers who would design impossible patches, or the workers who would labor around the clock to pump out flooded compartments, or the national will that would demand the impossible and then find a way to achieve it. They calculated for the ships as they existed on December 6, 1941. They did not calculate for what those ships, and the nation they represented, could become when challenged. The brass diving helmet, heavy and awkward, its small windows offering only a limited view, became the tool of national resurrection. Every diver who descended carried with him not just air hoses and tools, but the accumulated confidence of a nation that believed problems could be solved. They worked in water so dark they could not see their own hands, guided by touch and training and trust in the equipment that connected them to the surface. And when they emerged, when they reported progress, they were not just salvaging ships. They were salvaging the future. They were proving that December 7th was a day that would live in infamy, but not in permanence. That the flames and the smoke and the capsized hulls were not the end of the story but the beginning of a larger narrative about recovery and resolve. The Japanese strategists believed no one could lift a battleship. They were wrong. And in being wrong about that, they misunderstood the essential nature of the nation they had attacked, a nation whose greatest strength was not in never falling, but in always rising.